Greetings, folks. Nice to see you again. My name's Dustin Cormier, and welcome to How to Rock Astrology. Today we're going to be talking about, we're going to be continuing our reading of Light on Life by Robert Svodoba and Hart to Fouw. Today we're talking more on planetary strengths. We're still on Chapter 4, talking about the grahas, the planets, and how to interpret them. Right now, our particular conversation about planetary strengths, we are going to be talking about what it's like when a planet is in its own sign, its own rulership. It's the sign that it itself rules, as well as eventually in this episode we're also going to talk about Mulatrikona, which is another self-relating sign. Now, the following table shows the strength of planets based on constellational rulership. So I'm just going to turn this off here. As well as this. So these are the planetary rulerships of the constellations. The Sun basically just rules Leo, and its Mulatrikona is Leo. The Moon's constellation is Cancer, and the Moon's Mulatrikona is technically Taurus, just after its exaltation point of 3 degrees, right? The Moon's exalted in 3 degrees of Taurus, and then the rest is the Mulatrikona. Excuse me. Mars rules the sign of Aries and the sign of Scorpio. And Aries is the Mulatrikona. Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo. And Virgo is the Mulatrikona. There's something interesting to be said about the fact that Virgo and the Moon are the only planets that have their Mulatrikona, their root power, in a feminine constellation or an even number constellation, right? That's what this minus is all earth and water, and then the plus is air and fire. Mercury and the Moon are the only ones whose Mulatrikonas are in negative or even polarity signs, feminine signs. Jupiter's the constellations that Jupiter owns is Sagittarius and Pisces. Jupiter anciently rules Pisces more than Neptune, even though Western astrologers might have to learn that. And the Mulatrikona for Jupiter is Sagittarius. Venus's constellations are Libra and Taurus, and the Mulatrikona root is Libra. And this name's Ketu shouldn't be here, it should just be Saturn. Saturn's constellations are Aquarius and Capricorn, and the Mulatrikona is Aquarius. Now, these are all powerful positions for the planets, the most powerful of these being technically the Mulatrikona. Although, again, that's not necessarily to say that they're necessarily that benefic there. Although, generally, they are. Now, the 2 nodes are Chaya grahas, or shadow planets. Rahu and Ketu have position but no substance, which makes them difficult to know. Jyotishis throughout the ages have disagreed over which constellations the nodes rule, which constellations they are strong or weak in, and so on. This confusion just goes to show how strongly Rahu and Ketu sees. Though the nodes do not have independent rulership of any constellation, Nadi Jyotish sometimes assigns them the rulership of Aquarius and Aries, respectively. While we usually do take this to be the case, the average traditional Jyotishi does not use this principle when analyzing a horoscope. I lean on, this astrology thing can be all fun and games for theory, but if you're teaching a client and you aren't absolutely sure of a rule that involves Rahu and Ketu, unless you're looking to do that kind of digging, I would generally lean on being conservative about assuming that that prediction is going to be correct in every instance, because you're dealing with people's lives. So if you have a Rahu position and you're trying to design, if you're looking through this and you're trying to read into whether that Nadi Jyotish statement is true, then give it a go. See if it's, we need people researching these things and digesting and finding out for themselves if these things are true. But for my case, I'm probably I cut out all the things that are not absolutely sure in order that I can get to the bare bones of what everybody agrees is absolutely true and sure. And then I build my own explorations into innovations from those basic bones. That's just my method. Now, planets are strong and well placed when they occupy their own signs. They're strong as well placed. Unlike exalted planets, which can perform strongly for either good or bad, planets in their own constellations act only in favorable ways, at least by sign and by dignity, all other factors being equal. With the exception of the sun and the moon, which rule only one constellation each. There is a slight difference in the quality of effect for the placement of a planet in each of the two constellations that it rules. From Mars through Saturn, the grahas are said to be more favorable in their positive constellations than in their negative ones. From Mars through Saturn, which I'm assuming means Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn, aside from the sun and moon. Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. They all are more favorable in their positive constellations. That's Aries, Gemini, Sagittarius, Libra, and Aquarius, than their negative ones. I'm not sure how I'm reading or how I should be reading this exactly, because Mercury is not necessarily better in Gemini. I would say it's probably better in its Mulatrikona in Virgo, where it's also exalted. So this is a tricky definition here. Now, in terms of trinal strength, trinal strength has to do with what we call this Mulatrikona phenomenon. Almost every traditional work on Jyotish adds a further refinement to the system of exaltation and constellation rulership. A planet is strong for good or bad in the constellation where it's exalted, weak for good or bad in the constellation where it's debilitated, strong and almost always favorable when it's in its own positive constellation, and slightly less strong and favorable when it's in its own negative constellation. A planet is very strong and always favorable in its Mulatrikona. This is a Sanskrit word without an English equivalent. Mulatrikona. Mula means root, and trikona has to do with triangles and trines. We can tentatively translate Mulatrikona as trinal strength. A graha's Mulatrikona is the sector or zone of a particular constellation where each planet is exceptionally strong and favorable, even more so than its own positive constellation. And these are listed in this figure that we've been seeing here. So these are, this isn't a point to piss around on. Any planet that's in its Mulatrikona sign is bringing incredible strength to itself. I myself have Saturn in Aquarius at about 1 degree of Aquarius. So my Saturn is in this Mulatrikona position, and I feel it positively coming through me. Now, the addition of Mulatrikona can make analysis very complex when it's compounded with rulership and exaltation. For example, the situation of Mercury in the constellation of Virgo can be analyzed as follows. When Mercury is in the first 15 degrees of Virgo, it's exalted. In the next 5 degrees, it's in its Mulatrikona from 15 to 20 degrees. It's in its Mulatrikona, right? Virgo's Mulatrikona is 16 to 20 degrees of Virgo. And in the last 10 degrees, it is in its own negative constellation, where it is the least powerful. So 20 to 30 degrees of Virgo is the bit of the ripoff, although still, there are definitely worse places for Virgo. It is the least powerful of the the 4 available positions, right? First being the Mulatrikona from 16 to 20. Second being exaltation from 0 to 15. Third being in Gemini anywhere. And then the fourth being from 20 to 30 degrees of Virgo. In actual practice, unfortunately, Mulatrikona, according to these authors, is often ignored, since most Jyotishis see it as only a theoretical and pedantic consideration in the scheme of planetary strength. But in modern times, Mulatrikona is taken as second nature, it's taken for granted, and it's always considered important and benefic in the way that's been described. Here's one example of its use. Suppose a planet owns 2 constellations, one of which falls in a bad house. And we're going to see in Chapter 6 what's considered good and bad houses. While the other constellation is in a good house. If doubt arises how to interpret the planet's behavior, the planet will most likely give the results of the house in which its Mulatrikona constellation falls. So let's just take a quick little deacon peek here at some of our charts. Here we see in chart number 1 that we have a Gemini rising. Now Mars rules the 11th and the 6th houses, and these are considered evil houses in Vedic astrology. Now, so that's not a good example because they're both considered evil houses. Let's say Jupiter owns the 7th and the 10th. The Sun owns the 3rd. Chart number 2 might not be our best example here. So a better example might be for a Virgo. Well, in any case, the point here is that even in this Gemini rising, Aries is the Mulatrikona, which means that Mars will mostly be expressing 11th house vibrations, even though it also rules the 6th house of Scorpio and it's carrying the 6th house energy. This Mars is ultimately going to express 11th house energy because Aries rules the Mulatrikona of Mars, right? So you guys can see what's happening here. In the case of chart number 2, Mars rules the 3rd house from Virgo, as well as the 8th house from Virgo. And in this case, there's going to be an emphasis whenever something happens with Mars, whenever it shows up, or there's an important transit to Mars, Mars is going to display more of its character as the 8th lord, as carrying the 8th house energy, than it will of carrying 3rd house energy. Both of these are considered ill houses, but a better example, fortunately we don't have any, but a better example would be if we had like a Libra rising. For a Libra rising, I always use this as an example. Jupiter rules the 6th house and the 9th house for a Libra rising. The 9th house is obviously a trine Libra. Jupiter is in my apologies. Jupiter actually owns the 3rd and the 6th. So once again, that's not a good darn example. I believe I was talking about Cancer rising. I'm sorry, folks. I hope you guys are following me here. But I've found the example that I was thinking of. For a Cancer rising, Jupiter rules the 6th house, Sagittarius, as well as the 9th house, Pisces. But for a Cancer rising, Jupiter emphasizes more of the 6th house energy because, like we know, Sagittarius is the Mulatrikona of Jupiter. So for a Cancer rising, Jupiter is going to be displaying more of its 6th house energy because Sagittarius is the more emphasized one. Even though Jupiter also rules Pisces, which is the 9th house for Cancer. And that's a benefic position. The 9th house is always, it's one of the trine houses. It's always positive. But in the case of Jupiter for a Cancer, Jupiter is mostly going to be displaying the 6th house characteristics, the nagging Virgo tendencies. Kind of sucks that my phone is making this noise. Anyway, folks, so that was just my little description of constellation strength and trinal strength. Keep an eye out for our next episode because we're going to be talking about the very important concept of friendship. And we're going to see all the friendships of all the planets relating to each other because a planet that's not in its own sign, that's not in its Mulatrikona, that's not in exaltation or debilitation, is just going to be in the sign of another planet, right? Let's say we've got Jupiter in the sign of Cancer, again, right? How well is that Jupiter? Well, Jupiter's exalted in Cancer. Let's say instead we have Jupiter in Gemini. Jupiter has a certain relationship to Gemini. In fact, they're neutrals to each other. So we're going to see what it means that Jupiter in that case is in the sign of a neutral. As well as many other derivations, eventually we're going to see a big list of all these planetary strengths put together. So I hope you guys are enjoying this. I'm Dustin Cormier for How to Rock Astrology. I'll see you guys on the next episode as we continue on our journey of enlightenment through realizing and unfolding the ways of astrology. Thanks for watching.